What happens to your brain when the world changes before you finish becoming yourself? If you were born between 1976 and 1985, you didn't just grow up. You transitioned. You are often called Xennials, a microgeneration sitting between Gen X and Millennials. But labels don't fully capture what happened. You experienced two completely different cognitive environments during your developmental window. You had an analog childhood and a digital adulthood, and the timing of that shift may have shaped your psychology in ways we're only beginning to understand. Most generations grow up inside a single technological paradigm. Gen X largely formed identity before the internet. Millennials largely formed identity within it. But Xennials formed identity across both. As children, boredom was normal. You waited for your favorite TV show. You memorized phone numbers. You made plans without real-time updates. If you missed someone, you missed them. Social friction existed. Communication had delay, and delay builds tolerance. Psychologically, delay strengthens impulse control and patience. When rewards are not instant, the brain learns to regulate anticipation. Then the shift happened. Friendster, MySpace, Facebook. Cell phones in every pocket. The world didn't gradually digitize. It flipped. And critically, it flipped while your prefrontal cortex was still developing. Research published in Nature Neuroscience confirms that the prefrontal cortex responsible for executive function impulse regulation and adaptive reasoning continues maturing into the mid-20s. Xennials were in that high plasticity window during the technological overhaul. That matters, because brains wire themselves around environment. You were young enough to adapt quickly, but old enough to remember what existed before. This created something rare: cognitive bilingualism. You can operate offline comfortably, but you are fluent online. You remember what it felt like to be unreachable, but you don't fear new software. That dual encoding, analog and digital, may explain why many Xennials feel psychologically flexible yet subtly detached from generational extremes. You understand both sides, but fully belong to neither. And that sense of liminality, of existing between categories, shapes identity formation. Developmental psychology shows that identity stabilizes through shared narratives. When your generational narrative is unclear, identity becomes more individualized. Xennials often report feeling slightly out of sync with both Gen X cynicism and millennial digital immersion, not because they lack identity, but because their identity was formed during transition. And transition builds adaptability, but it also builds subtle vigilance, because if the world can change once that dramatically, it can change again. You're the last group who remembers what it felt like to disappear, not metaphorically, literally. There was a time when no one could reach you for hours, and that was normal. If you were born between 1976 and 1985, your childhood unfolded without permanent documentation. Your worst haircut, your awkward phase, your teenage mistakes. They existed in memory, not metadata. And psychologically, that matters. Autobiographical memory is not a fixed recording. It is fluid. Research in cognitive psychology shows that memory reconstructs itself every time we recall it. We edit. We soften. We reinterpret. This flexibility allows emotional healing. But permanent digital documentation interferes with that process. When every event is searchable, replayable, screen-captured identity becomes frozen in time. Younger generations grow up with an external archive of themselves. Xennials did not. Your embarrassing moments faded naturally. Your past was allowed to evolve. That creates a different relationship with identity continuity. You were not curated from adolescence. You were remembered. And memory, unlike documentation, is forgiving. This influences privacy perception as well. Gen X often values privacy because they lived entirely outside digital permanence. Millennials grew up broadcasting by default. Xennials sit in between. You understand exposure, but you remember obscurity. This creates ambivalence. You use social media, but you don't entirely trust it. You share, but selectively. You post, but cautiously, because you experienced both psychological states, life before performance, and life within it. And here's the deeper layer. Constant reachability changes attachment patterns. In the analog era, communication required effort and delay. You left messages. You waited. Plans involved commitment because adjustment wasn't instantaneous. That delay reinforced reliability. Now communication is frictionless. Where are you running late? Actually can't make it. The ability to constantly renegotiate plans subtly changes relational expectations. Xennials experienced both relational models during formative years. Attachment theory suggests early relational norms shape adult expectations. You internalized patience-based connection, then adapted to immediacy-based connection. That creates flexibility, but also internal tension. You appreciate responsiveness, but you resent hyperavailability. You value independence, but you adapt to connectivity. And that tension extends to attention itself. You developed concentration in an environment without constant digital interruption. Homework required sustained focus. Entertainment was limited. Boredom was common. And boredom is cognitively productive. Neuroscientific research shows that boredom activates the default mode network, the brain system responsible for introspection and creative integration. Boredom builds imagination. But during early adulthood, you entered the smartphone era. Attention fragmentation arrived while your executive function systems were still maturing. This timing is unique. Older Gen X developed full executive control before digital saturation. Younger millennials formed executive control within it. Xennials developed executive function across the transition, which may explain why many report oscillating attention styles. You can focus deeply, but you also feel the pull of distraction. You know what sustained attention feels like, and you know how easy it is to lose it. This dual awareness may create mild cognitive dissonance. You remember patience, but live in acceleration. You remember absence, but inhabit presence. And psychologically, this can create what researchers call temporal layering, holding two versions of reality simultaneously. The pre-digital self and the digital self. Few generations experience such a clean before and after divide during identity formation. And that divide doesn't disappear. It becomes part of how you process change. You have lived proof that systems can transform rapidly, which leads into the economic shock that defined your early adulthood. But before we go there, it's important to understand something subtle. Growing up analog built internal regulation. Growing into digital required external adaptation. You didn't grow up optimized for algorithmic stimulation. You adjusted to it. And that distinction may explain why many Xennials feel both comfortable online and vaguely fatigued by it. You know what quiet felt like, which means noise is noticeable. Just as you were stepping into adulthood, the floor collapsed. Not metaphorically. Financially. If you were born between 1976 and 1985, your late 20s aligned almost perfectly with the 2008 financial crisis. And timing is everything. Developmental psychology shows that the late 20s and early 30s are when identity solidifies around career financial independence and long-term planning. It's when effort is supposed to convert into stability. Instead, many Xennials walked into a job market that evaporated. Companies downsized. Housing markets crashed. Retirement funds dissolved. And even for those who kept their jobs, something shifted internally. Trust. Economic imprint theory suggests that large-scale financial disruptions during early adulthood permanently alter risk perception. Individuals who experience economic instability during this stage often develop heightened vigilance around security even decades later. It's not just about money. It's about predictability. Before 2008, the narrative was still intact. Work hard. Climb steadily. Buy a home. Build wealth. After 2008, that narrative fractured. For Xennials, this rupture happened at the exact moment they were supposed to believe in the system most strongly. That matters psychologically, because when institutions fail during identity consolidation, adaptation becomes defensive. You learn to hedge, to diversify, to prepare for instability, to never fully assume permanence. This is why many Xennials quietly over-prepare. Multiple income streams, emergency funds larger than necessary, cautious career moves. From the outside, it looks like pragmatism. Internally, it often contains a subtle memory. It can disappear. Financial trauma does not require homelessness. It requires unpredictability. And unpredictability during adulthood formation leaves cognitive residue. Neuroscience shows that stress during transitional life stages increases baseline vigilance in the amygdala, the brain's threat detection system. Even after stability returns, the body remembers. This can manifest not as panic, but as preparedness. Xennials are often described as adaptable, and they are. But adaptability often develops from forced adjustment. You didn't grow into stability. You grew into volatility. And volatility trains flexibility, but it also trains caution. Here's where the generational contrast becomes clearer. Gen X often distrusts systems because they saw institutional failure across decades. Millennials often distrust systems because they never fully experienced institutional reliability. Xennials experience the promise, and then experienced its collapse. That creates a different psychological dynamic. You believed long enough to be disappointed, but young enough to pivot. This pivot required cognitive restructuring. You redefined success. Maybe homeownership wasn't immediate. Maybe career paths were nonlinear. Maybe security meant liquidity instead of permanence. You adjusted. But adjustment is metabolically expensive. Chronic adaptation requires constant recalibration, and constant recalibration creates low-grade stress, not dramatic anxiety, but background vigilance. Is this stable? Should I trust this? What's the backup plan? This doesn't make Xennials pessimistic. It makes them contingency thinkers, but contingency thinking can quietly exhaust, because planning for collapse requires mental rehearsal of collapse, which leads to an interesting paradox. Xennials often appear calm in crisis because they've practiced, but they may struggle with sustained trust in stability. The world already flipped once during development. Why wouldn't it flip again? And this experience layered on top of the analog to digital transition. First, technology restructured social life. Then, economics restructured financial life. Two systemic overhauls during identity formation. Few generations absorb that density of transition in such a tight window. This may explain why many Xennials describe feeling between worlds not only culturally, but psychologically. Not nostalgic like Gen X. Not digitally native like millennials. Not fully secure. Not fully destabilized. Independent. But cautious. Optimistic. But braced. And here is the deeper insight. Living through systemic shifts during neuroplastic windows builds adaptive cognition. Your brain learns flexibility, but it also learns impermanence. You can pivot, but you rarely assume permanence. That duality defines much of the Xennial psychological profile. What if not fitting in was never a flaw, but a function? Xennials are often described as the generation that doesn't quite belong. Too young to fully identify with Gen X cynicism. Too old to fully merge with millennial digital immersion. But psychological liminality existing between categories is not confusion. It's perspective. In anthropology, liminal individuals occupy transitional states. They are neither fully one thing nor the other. Historically, liminal roles were powerful. They were interpreters, translators, mediators between worlds. Xennials grew up between eras, not gradually, sharply. You remember when privacy was default. You adapted to when exposure became currency. You learned patience in analog systems, then learned velocity in digital systems. You trusted institutions long enough to see them fracture, then recalibrated. This produces a specific cognitive pattern contradiction tolerance. Most people prefer coherent narratives, stable categories, clear generational identities. But Xennials developed inside discontinuity. And discontinuity trains synthesis. You can appreciate the efficiency of modern life while mourning what was lost. You can adopt new systems without fully surrendering skepticism. You can hold independence while valuing collaboration. Psychologically, this is integrative complexity, the ability to recognize multiple perspectives and reconcile tension between them. Research shows individuals high in integrative complexity adapt better to rapidly changing environments. They are less reactive to black and white narratives. They tolerate ambiguity without panic. Growing up during technological and economic transition may have trained this capacity implicitly. You didn't choose complexity. You inherited it. And here's the deeper layer. Because you experienced rupture early, you understand that identity cannot be anchored solely to environment. Environments change. Systems shift. Platforms rise and collapse. If identity is externally anchored, transition destabilizes it. But if identity becomes internally structured, built around values rather than conditions, adaptation becomes survivable. Xennials often learned this lesson unconsciously. Your childhood environment no longer exists. Your early adult economic assumptions dissolved. If you attached your sense of self purely to those conditions, fragmentation would follow. So many of you adapted by internalizing identity. Not as the world I grew up in, but as the way I move through change. That distinction matters. You are not defined by analog nostalgia, nor by digital fluency. You are defined by transition itself, and transition builds meta-awareness. You know that change accelerates, which means you're less shocked by it. You know systems aren't permanent, which makes you pragmatic. You know documentation changes memory, which makes you cautious about oversharing. You know attention can fragment, which makes you more intentional when you choose to disconnect. In many ways, Xennials became bridge thinkers. You can explain pre-digital norms to younger generations. You can translate digital language to older ones. You understand both skepticism and optimism. This bridging role often goes unnoticed, but bridges are rarely celebrated. They are simply used. And yet, being a bridge requires structural strength. There is also a subtle existential layer. When you grow up between paradigms, you realize something early. Stability is temporary. That awareness can produce anxiety, but it can also produce resilience. Because if nothing is permanent, then flexibility becomes survival. And flexibility becomes identity. Not frantic adaptability, but quiet adjustment. You do not panic at software updates, nor do you romanticize outdated systems. You evaluate. You choose. You move. This balanced cognition may become increasingly valuable as technological acceleration continues. Generations that grew up entirely digital may struggle if the digital paradigm shifts again. Generations that never embrace digital may resist further change. But transitional generations have rehearsal. You've already lived through systemic pivot. You know how it feels, and you know it's survivable. Perhaps the defining psychological strength of Xennials is not independence, not adaptability, not skepticism. It's calibration, the ability to adjust without losing coherence, to evolve without dissolving, to integrate rather than abandon. And maybe that's why you sometimes feel slightly out of place, because belonging to a stable category requires stability. You were shaped by instability, but instability trained awareness. You saw the before, you lived the after, and you carry both. Not fragmented, integrated. In a world accelerating faster than anyone predicted, that integration may be the most valuable inheritance of all. Not because you are superior, but because you practiced adaptation before adaptation became mandatory. If you're a Xennial, you are not misplaced. You are positioned between worlds. And sometimes that's exactly where clarity lives.